excited to welcome Ariel Tachna to the podcast. Ariel lives outside of Houston with her husband, daughter, son, and their cat. Before moving there, she traveled all over the world, having fallen in love with both France, where she found her husband, and India, where she dreams of retiring someday. She's bilingual with snippets of 4 other languages to her credit, and is as in love with languages as she is with writing. In addition to the writing, she's also Dreamspinner Press's translations coordinator. Ariel has 2 books out this spring, Talking in Code, which released in March, and Stage 2, which continues her Dreamspun Desires series, Lexington Lovers. And Stage 2 arrives May 1st. Welcome, Ariel.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, we're excited. We only had that little bit of you talking to us at the DSP conference back in 2016, so it's good to have you back to get to talk more in detail.
Yes, absolutely.
So I have to ask, before we get into the questions, having just introduced you, what makes you want to retire in India?
Everything.
Okay, that's fair.
We went in 2003. My husband was born in India, moved to the U.S. when he was 15, and he hadn't been back. So we went in 2003, hoping to get there, so that I could meet his grandparents while some of them at least were still alive. I met the 2 grandparents who were still alive, his mother's father and his father's mother, both of whom were lovely. The area of India that he's from, which is Kerala in southern India, strikes me as just an incredible place. It's beautiful, it's tropical, but the thing that struck me the most about it was we were there at Christmas. And so we got there in the middle of an Hindu holiday. And so there were tons of people, there were fireworks going off every night, but the fireworks weren't just going off at the Hindu temple. The Catholic Church and the mosque, that were all on the same street, put off fireworks too, because our neighbors were celebrating, and so we should celebrate with them. And then a few days later, it was Christmas, we go to midnight mass. After midnight mass, we're putting fireworks off at the Catholic Church, and the next thing you know, there are fireworks going off at the temple and at the mosque. Because we're celebrating, and so they should celebrate with us. And you don't find that kind of feeling in so many places in the world. Mm-hmm. Too many places are all about the divisions and not about my neighbors are celebrating, let me celebrate with them.
Mm-hmm. I love that. That's awesome. I like this little story, too, that your husband was born in India but grew up in the U.S., but you found him in France.
Yes.
There's a book there. There's a book there somewhere.
We were exchange students the same semester in Dijon, and that's where we got to know each other. I had actually met him before we went to France, but I could have told you all of 2 or 3 things about him. And actually, he didn't grow up. He moved to the U.S. when he was 15. He was in Nigeria for most of his childhood.
Oh wow!
He's had an interesting life.
Little traveler. There's a book there somewhere.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, my Advent calendar story for 2015 incorporated some of our trip to India.
Okay.
I tend to do that. I tend to grab things that have struck me and have them show back up in books.
Oh, sure. Speaking of books, let's dive in.
Okay.
Talking in Code, which was your book that came out back in March. Tell us what that's about.
Talking in Code is a paramilitary, not paranormal, but paramilitary, meaning they're not part of the official military, menage romance. But it doesn't start at the beginning of the story, which is the thing that made it both interesting and challenging to write. At the Dream Center workshop, and this was something that really struck me, Kate McMurray made a comment that the story starts when the status quo breaks. Mm-hmm. In one of her presentations. And I thought, okay, that explains why Talking in Code doesn't start at the beginning. Why it doesn't start the day that the 3 men meet. Because that's not where the status quo breaks. The status quo breaks when the way that they worked their relationship out didn't work anymore. Mm-hmm. And so that goes back into what we ended up with, or what we started with, was essentially a long-term couple, and one of the guys in the long-term couple was kind of interested in another guy, and so they brought him in, but the third guy always kind of felt like Richard was playing along, that Tim was the one who was interested in Eric, and so Richard was just kind of going along with it to make Tim happy. And Richard always kind of felt like Eric was really interested in Tim and just took him because the only way he could have Tim was to also be involved with Richard. Okay, so this has been going on this way, and it's not that Eric and Richard don't get along. It's not that they fight. It's nothing like that. It's just that they never really developed a relationship between the two of them. Mm-hmm. So the book begins when situation forces Eric and Richard to finally develop that third leg of the triangle, because Tim is injured in the hospital and isn't in a position to be there and be that pivot point around which the two of them circle. And so they've got to be with each other because Tim's not there. And that's the starting point of the book.
Mm-hmm. When the status quo breaks.
When the status quo breaks.
What was your inspiration for this? Because this sounds like you took on several challenges here, paramilitary and this kind of different structure to story and that kind of thing.
This was one of those that just kind of came out of nowhere. You know, stories for me come from lots of different places. Maybe it's a snippet of a conversation. Maybe it's a comment that Nikki makes to me. That's frequently a comment that Nikki makes to me. Maybe it's a dream, and maybe just the idea pops up. And the thing for me as a reader as well as a writer is that I get bored easily. Mm-hmm. I don't want to read the same thing over and over and over again, which doesn't mean that I don't go back and reread favorite books. But if I've read a story, then the next one needs to be different. It's honestly one of the reasons why so much of the reading that I did growing up was fantasy rather than romance, because romance felt repetitive a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And so as a writer, that's kind of what I'm always doing. I'm always looking for, where's the next challenge? Where's the thing that's going to make the next book interesting to me? Because if it's not interesting to me, there's no way I'm going to make it interesting to my readers.
Right.
And so this was just one of those ideas that popped up. I was reading a lot of military stuff at the time, you know, romance, fan fiction, the whole 9 yards, and kind of playing around with the idea of it would be different to write something in there. And here we go. I mean, you know.
And it's the start of a new series, right?
Well, yes and no. My blog tour around this book, because as I said, it starts in the middle of their relationship. So there was no first meeting across the room. There was no first kiss. There was no, how are we bringing Eric into this relationship? It was, the book starts with fixing the third leg. And so I wrote 7 short stories that came up to about 10,000 words that hit some of those highlights from the early piece of the relationship that were referenced in the book but weren't written out. Mm-hmm. And so actually what that series piece refers to, those 7 short stories are going to be packaged as an ebook and thrown up on Dreamspinner's site for free.
Oh, nice. Okay.
That way people who, whether they read them in the blog tour or not, they'll be able to have them on their e-readers, on their Kindles, you know, wherever they read from, and be able to keep those stories instead of having to try to always go back and find the blog posts and what if the blog closes and blah, 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 blah.
Well, that's awesome. I like that.
Yes. So the series pieces are the 7 prequels, mm-hmm. 7 little short stories that about 10,000 words, and they'll be free. I believe they come out in June.
Excellent.
Or July. Now that I've said June, I'm not sure. Sometime this summer. They'll be out on Dreamspinner's website as a free download for anybody who wants them.
Very nice. Now, flipping over to a completely different kind of book.
Yes.
We've got Stage 2 coming out on May 1st.
Yes.
And that's another installment in Lexington Lovers for the Dreamspun Desires series. What's happening in Lexington this time?
We are headed to a high school. We have an assistant principal at Henry Clay High School, which incidentally is the school where my sister works. So I was able to get lots of good information from her about all the ways. That's the thing about this whole Lexington series. I grew up there. This is home for me, even if I haven't lived there in almost 30 years. And so when I wrote the first one, and it was with the horses and the horse farms. Where else was I going to set it but the horse world in Lexington that I had been such a part of growing up? The farm is based on one that I worked at, the whole 9 yards. And then when I got ready to write the second one, I thought, do I want to just have some random Dreamspun Desires, or do I want to try to link them in some way? Mm-hmm. And the idea came up that I could set them all in Lexington. And then I could do fun things like having Clay and Luke from Unstable Stud make a cameo in Matchless Man, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Without having to be linked, without anybody having to have read one in order to read the other. But for the people who do read them all, there's little Easter eggs. Mm-hmm. So anyway, back to stage 2 specifically, we have an assistant principal at Henry Clay High School who is trying to help 2 troubled teens. And in the process of trying to help these two troubled teens, meets their guardian / uncle, who it turns out is the guy he had his very first crush on when he was in high school 20 years ago. Now, the other guy didn't know it at the time, freshman, senior. Thane doesn't remember Blake at all, but Blake remembers Thane. Thane has a history with high school administrators. He was a bit of a bad boy in high school. And so when he comes into the office, even though he doesn't remember Blake, he has none of that history. He has his own history with what it means to be called into the office and what high school administrators are like, etc. And so he comes in with an attitude. And so you have the sparks fly. And so it's a mixture of the one that got away and enemies to lovers, because, of course, when Thane walks in that office, Blake is the enemy.
I can't wait to read this.
Blake doesn't see Thane that way. Thane certainly sees Blake that way. And the other piece of this, then, is Thane's only been guardian of his nephews for about 6 weeks. So you could almost call it a secret baby kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Unexpected kid. His twin sister, had died of cancer, and he took the boys after her death, which really only barely plays in the story. It only in the sense that the boys are troubled, obviously, having lost their mother and having been displanted to live with their uncle. But there's also the piece of the Thane and the boys having to develop that relationship and how his relationship with them plays into his eventual relationship with Blake.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And I'm looking forward to read this. I love second chance stories. And then you throw, enemies to friends in there too. It's going to be fun. Yes. I like how you incorporate children / teenagers / siblings in the books. Like, I really liked Matchless Man, mm-hmm. with how the romance in that was almost of an equal weight to how the brothers were forming their relationship too.
Right. Well, nobody exists in a bubble. The relationship that, certainly in a romance, you have to have a romantic relationship, or you don't have a romance.
Right.
But the idea that the only characters who matter, the only characters who influence things are the 2 main characters, or if we go back to Talking in Code, the 3 main characters, just doesn't hold weight. I mean, go back to My Husband and Me for a minute. If it hadn't been for our friend Brian, who was the best man in our wedding, telling my husband, hey, you do know she's interested in you, right? And he says, no. I couldn't have been any more obvious. I mean, really, I couldn't have been any more obvious. If it hadn't been for Brian, I don't know that my husband would have ever gotten a clue. Mm-hmm. And now, 20 years, almost 21 years later, well, 25 if you count from when we started dating, where would I be? Maybe not where I am, So romance doesn't happen in a vacuum. And not including those other things, to me, does a disservice to the depth of the story.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Especially in the case of like the brother in Matchless Man or the nephews in stage 2, where those relationships are going to impact not just the romance, not just the falling in love piece, but the long-term life piece. Mm-hmm. If Brent and Navashen are going to be together, Akshat's going to be a part of that.
Yep.
Not in a romantic sense, but he's going to be part of their lives, and his presence is going to impact that. And that if Brent weren't okay with that, if he didn't know how to manage that, the romance wouldn't be believable. And the same thing is going to be true with Blake and Thane. If the nephews can't, if they can't fit into that creation of a family, then that romance isn't going to be believable.
So you mentioned Lexington's where you grew up and why
Yes.
you set the Lexington Lovers series there. How many more books do you foresee in the series as time goes on?
I have one more already sort of basically plotted out. The answer is as many as I feel like writing, because with it not having, Lexington's not a huge city. It's not Houston, but 300,000 people, 2 universities, the horse industry, there's a lot going on in Lexington. And so there's a lot of, pretty much any story that I envisioned that didn't involve military could be set in Lexington. So it's more a matter of, oh, this would make a good Dreamspun. Okay, let me write it in Lexington. As opposed to having a set number of stories in mind. Mm-hmm. And because they can be read in any order, because they're only loosely connected, there's not the sense of, okay, I've got to plan out the whole series because people are going to be waiting to see what happens. They're going to be waiting for so-and-so's story. They're not waiting for any specific character story because that's not the way it works. Mm-hmm. You don't meet Blake and Thane in Matchless Man. You see Brent and Navashed, or you see Brent, Navashed's referred to. You see Brent in stage 2. But you're not waiting for Blake and Thane's story at the end of Matchless Man because you haven't met them yet. Mm-hmm. And so there's not the I've got to have this all laid out in advance, which I don't do very well. I'm a total pantser. But so, as I said, one more planned and then we'll see.
Very good. So we talked about the cat in the bio.
Yes.
But I hear a dog. Do you want to introduce the dog?
I have 2 dogs, Max and Milo. They are in the other room, but they don't like the yard man that's out in my neighbor's yard, and that's what they're barking at.
Oh, bad yard man.
They want to be let out of their kennel so that they can go stand at the window and bark at the yard man.
So we talked about Talking in Code being a very different book, and then we've got the Dreamspuns that you do that, of course, follow the category of romance kind of recipe.
Right.
And then you talked about how you like to stay fresh as a writer. So certainly we see the mix in there. What's it like to you to swing back and forth in these styles as you go from book to book? Because you must go project to project relatively quickly because you're putting out books regularly.
Mm-hmm. Right. Honestly, coming off of Talking in Code was hard. Stage 2 was actually written before Talking in Code, but because of the Dreamspun schedule, it's not coming out until after. Mm-hmm. That just was coincidentally. But it is coming off of Talking in Code and going into my next project, which is the 3rd of my At Your Service series, which is the stories inspired by waiters that I have known in various places, the restaurants in the world. This one is set in Germany, but coming off of Talking in Code, which was an immediate drop you into the middle of the action, drive you as hard as I could kind of story, to the new Waiter book, which is a much slower start. It was definitely an adjustment, and I think it took me a little bit longer to do that transition than I expected. Mm-hmm. Of course, I'm also going to blame part of that on the fact that I finished Talking in Code, and then I had the idea for the prequels, and so went and started. So I wasn't quite I was trying to start the next project while I hadn't quite let go of Talking in Code.
Yeah,
because I was doing the short stories around it, and then of course with all the edits and everything that hit, it was a long time before I was completely out of that mindset. And so it was a bit of a challenge to switch gears this time, more so than I expected.
How many projects do you tend to have going at once?
It depends. It depends on whether I'm writing with Nikki, which we're currently not working on something. We finished Stronghold, and we have one more book that we have planned together, but we haven't started it yet because she has a Dreamspun deadline at the end of this month. And she doesn't juggle projects as well, and I shouldn't say as well, as easily as I do. Mm-hmm. And so she tends to, especially if she has a fixed deadline, she tends to write one thing and then be done with it and then go to write the other one. So at the moment, Nikki and I don't have anything that we're working on together.
And we should say that's Nikki Bennett, who you've partnered up with a number of times. I write with on occasion. I try to make it more frequently, but, life keeps getting in the way, hers or mine, because, with all the gearing up for the Paris Book Fair last month, I didn't get a whole lot of writing done the last 3 months myself. So that's why I tend to have lots of releases in the spring and not as many releases in the fall, because in the spring, when I'm writing, or I'm not writing, so when I'm writing, the books then come out, 6 months after that. Anyway, at the moment, I have what I would consider 2 active projects, plus some things that I've written a little bit on, and may eventually go back and pick up. So the 2 active projects are the 4th Lexington Lovers book and then the 3rd Waiters book that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. Neither of which have a title yet, because I'm not good at titles. I finish the book and I send it to Nikki and I say, it needs a title. And usually she comes up with one for me. And what's your overall process? Plotter, pantser, in the middle?
Absolute pantser. It drives Nikki crazy because she's a complete plotter, which makes writing together interesting at times. No, I am very much a pantser. I start a story with a situation, a general idea of the characters, a general idea of the conflict, and a happy ending. Mm-hmm. Because, I'm writing romance, so happy ending is a given. And then the other thing that I work very hard to keep in mind, not planning ahead, but as I'm writing, is the idea of, and I think you were at Damon's scene and sequence presentation, mm-hmm. Yeah. Is that idea that, so that there needs to be something happens, and then there's an emotional reaction that leads to something happening that leads to an emotional reaction. I don't have to know what those are ahead of time. I just have to know that I'm going into this scene and something's going to happen that's going to cause this kind of emotional moment. And then as I write through that emotional moment, I can see, okay, that's going to lead to this. I used to try to plot, and my characters kept throwing my plot out of the window and saying, no, that's not the story we have to tell. And so I've discovered for myself that if I will let them tell me their story, it's a much more authentic tale at the end.
How did that work well in Talking in Code? Because that book seems more complex than a Dreamspun Desire or some of the other contemporaries that you've done.
The thing about it, it is in certain respects, but in other respects it isn't. Because, for all of the trappings around it that put them in the situation they're in, what it really is a really, really, really broken man trying, and his lover trying to help him put himself back together. Mm.
I guess when you boil it right down, you have a typical romance. There was
research into where are they going to be in the hospital, what kinds of, with Tim, how long is it going to take before Tim's going to be able to wake up, and those kinds of things. But I'm married to a doctor. So, to some extent, there's a question of going and saying, hey, tell me how this works. and Zara Owens, who's also a very good friend of mine, is a former ICU nurse. And so between the two of them, yes, there's issues around, okay, they're on a military base, but they're not actually military. They're paramilitary. They're former military working alongside the military. So I didn't have to worry about getting into a whole lot of military regulations and things like that, because those, for the most part, didn't apply to them.
Right. They do their own thing.
They choose which missions they're going to take.
Which means you choose whatever you want.
Yeah, exactly. To some extent. Richard's comment is we created their organization to take the missions that the U.S. military couldn't, mm-hmm. because they couldn't be seen to be involved in a place, not the ones that they wouldn't, as in it was too risky. Mm-hmm. So, yes, there were trappings that were complicated. There certainly were relationship pieces, because even as Richard and Eric were building that third leg of their triangle, Tim loomed large in that conversation, because even though he wasn't in the room at that moment because he was in the hospital in ICU, he was coming back. After about 40 pages, they knew he was going to live. They just didn't know when he was going to wake up and what his recovery was going to look like. So there was always that, we're going to have to bring him back in. He's going to be part of this again. And so there was that piece that was a little bit more complicated, but this isn't the first Menage story I've written either. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it is the first one where we had an established couple bringing in a third, as opposed to the threesome forming as a threesome. But, like I said, it keeps it interesting.
That's right.
And yes, it did work. I mean, I had the beginning, happy ending. This was the issue.
Now, besides being an author, you also coordinate Dreamspinner's translations.
Yes.
Tell us what that entails, and give our audience who may not understand just exactly how many languages DSP has their books in these days.
Okay. Well, there are two pieces to it. We do in-house translations, which actually all are funneled through me to a group of translators in Italian, German, and French. But then I also work with a group of foreign publishers who sublicense our books. And at this point, we are in 12 different languages. So we have sublicensed our books into French, Spanish, German, Italian, Turkish, Hungarian, Finnish, Hebrew, Korean, Thai, Japanese, and Malaysian.
Which is just incredible. Yes.
And that number that's what we've done so far. If we're in negotiations with a publisher in Brazil. We've had some interest in Taiwan, with the possibility of it going into Chinese. We've, had some interest in Greece. So who knows what tomorrow will bring.
Right. What's involved in picking the titles and actually getting the translations to make sure that everything, for lack of a better word, translates?
Right. Correctly. Well, I just actually had this conversation with an author whose title was an idiomatic expression. A set phrase where, not to insult anybody's intelligence, but a figurative expression, one where the words where the meaning of the phrase is more than the meaning of the individual words.
Okay.
So something like, I'm climbing the walls. You're not actually climbing the walls. It's a figurative expression. Anyway, the title was a figurative expression for which there was not a comparable expression in German. And so we were going back and forth with, how are we going to translate this title so that we get both the sense of it and the sense of the story? Mm-hmm. We finally found a compromise, but it was not a simple thing. It was not let's call it this. Mm-hmm. So for the ones that are sublicensed, those publishers approach us and they request the rights to the books that they feel are going to work in their markets for their publishing houses. I have a monthly newsletter that I send out to them with all of our upcoming releases so that they're aware of what our books are, but it's up to them ultimately to decide what they're going to publish. In terms of the things that we do in-house, we've had our translations department now for 5 years. And so we have some market data on what the different markets enjoy reading, what books sell in Italy, what books sell in Germany, what books sell in France. When we were starting with our all-time bestsellers on the theory that if they were an all-time bestseller, they probably would have a fairly universal appeal. Mm-hmm. And that's actually played out fairly well. But then as we started getting into other things, what we've discovered, for example, is that the French love their mysteries. And so unlike, say, in the U.S., where contemporary romance, pure and simple, tend to be our bestsellers in France tend to be the ones with a mystery subplot or a historical subplot, or a historical setting, which is the complete opposite of the U.S. Or the English market is what I should say. The Italian market very much mimics the U.S. market. Contemporaries are by far the most popular, with Westerns, paranormals coming in second, and with other things much lower down. And the Germans really like their Westerns, and they really like their BDSM.
That's a little disparate between Westerns and BDSM.
And, I'm telling you what the sales data says. I'm not making any value judgments, any explanations. This is what the sales data says.
Right.
So at this point, it used to be that translation was pretty much just take a book, translate it all the way across the board. At this point, we are very much tailoring things to the markets. And so a book that's translated into French may or may not be translated into German or Italian, or may not be translated as quickly into German or Italian. And the same thing for German, a book that goes into German first or into Italian first. But we're very, very excited about the growth that we've seen. We have just this year managed to get enough German translators that we're now up to a German translation every week. We've been at that level for Italian for a while. At French, we're actually working on moving to 6 a month instead of 4 a month. We had been doing a release a week, but now what we're going to do is a novel a week and a couple of novellas each month. Mm-hmm. And because this is where we're seeing growth. We had huge growth across the board in all 3 languages last year for the second year in a row, where we've had significant, 3-digit percentage growth across the board. And so it's kind of hard to argue with. Actually, the French growth was 3,000%. Mm-hmm. Kind of hard to argue with that, with those growth figures.
Absolutely. I mean, that's just amazing. And it even extends to formatting some of these books into new creations, because there are the ones that we saw at the DSP conference that are becoming the graphic novels in some markets.
That's right. And that's actually starts with one of our Korean partners, but we have the rights to those images. And so we have a French translator who also speaks Korean, who is translating, and English, who is translating the graphic novels from Korean back into English, because they're being created in Korean from the Korean translations of those books. Mm-hmm. So she's translating them back into English so that the authors can go through them and make sure that the dialogue reads in English the way they want them to be read. And then once those are complete in English, we'll actually be able to have those translated into any language we want to have them translated into.
That's amazing.
So that's very exciting.
Yeah. That must be an exciting part of your job, to get to work in that separate from your author side, since you do love language so much.
I do. It's a lot of fun. My French translators at this point all know, or most of them know, that I speak French. And so I actually end up, about half the emails I send on any given day are in French instead of in English, which is fun because it keeps me in practice.
Absolutely. So in terms of the rest of the year, you mentioned the 4th Lexington novel being worked on along with the next one in At Your Service. Anything else kind of that we can look forward to as 2017 rolls on?
No.
No.
I hate to say it that way, but the reality is that I finished Talking in Code, and then all the preparation for the Paris Book Fair hit.
Right.
And during that time, I do very little writing. And so my comment about my books all coming out in the first 6 months of the year and then nothing in the second half of the year, there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
And seeing as how I already have more authors signed up for the Paris Book Fair next year than I even had this year, I expect that to reproduce itself. Now that that's over, I'll be able to write for the next 6 months, get some things ready that'll be out for the beginning of 2018, during that period when I'll be preparing everything for Paris and going to Paris and not writing.
Right. So we'll talk again about this time next year for Lexington 4 and At Your Service.
Exactly.
So what's the best way for folks to keep up with you online so they can track everything with your writing and your translations and everything else that goes on?
I'm on Facebook as Ariel Tachna. I do have an author page that I always forget about, so friend me on my profile. That's a much better way to get information from me. I am on Twitter, except that at the moment my phone is not cooperating, so I am not on Twitter very much. At Ariel Tachna. And then they can check out my website at arieltachna.com.
You have branded yourself perfectly. Poppy would be proud.
Hey, I did that for enough years for Dreamspinner. All those lectures I gave about how to make sure you're branded. Practice what you preach.
That's right. That's right. Well, Ariel, thank you so much for being with us. It's been excellent talking with you.
My pleasure.